All right. I know everyone's kind of filing in after lunch. The room is relatively cool, but I totally understand that this is now a 75-minute session after tacos and nachos. So if you need to stretch your legs, there's plenty of room in the room where you can just stand up, stretch for a minute, go grab a drink from the hallway, whatever you need. Stay comfortable. You're not gonna degrade the experience for anyone else. The other reminder that I have in general is just that all of the sessions that are a part of VS Live have session surveys, this one included. So make sure that as you have time, even if it's on your way back home after the conference, you take the time to hop into the app and complete the session evaluations. They're all in that app, so this QR code is not that specific to this session, it's just in general for the app. That does help inform the sessions that come to VS Live at different renditions, as well as for individual presenters. It helps us and everyone shape their presentation style, as well as the content that they bring. I'm Drew Squires-Cabala. I am a product manager, program manager at Microsoft. So things you put in that survey around what you would like in Visual Studio and things like that, that's not the right place to put that, but I will come back to how can you share some feedback on the Microsoft tooling that we talk about today. At Microsoft right now, I am the PM for what I'll call generically SQL tooling and libraries. This stretches from the SQL Server data tools in Visual Studio all the way over to, in the last couple of years, I've worked on SSMS for a while. Someone else has that right now, but we all work together in that same team, as well as some of the underlying libraries that, again, we'll talk about today. Before I joined Microsoft about 5 years ago, I was a developer. I had a problem saying no, so I was also the DBA for a little while. And I was fortunate enough to be the team lead as well for a period of time, which was a great experience to help other people grow. And that is part of why I like coming to events like this and talking to you, because I get the opportunity to learn from you, but I also help to impart at least a nugget that you get to take back to your teams and your groups that may improve the processes that you have today. On the side, if you want to talk to me about something not technology related at all, I can recommend gardening and chickens. I will talk your ear off. But what we are going to talk about in this session, the title talks about SQL projects, so obviously we're headed to talk about databases. But at the end of the day, it really gets down to DevOps, because the databases end up in this funky place when we're working as developers where there's some things we can control and some things we don't. And there's some things that are okay for us to mess with and some things we definitely should not. And we have a version of the database somewhere that maybe kind of looks like production, but not really. And there's all these kinds of intricacies and potential pitfalls. So as we put together our plan for how do we develop databases, if we bring the foundation of DevOps in with us, we end up having better long-term success. The first part is culture. I've already talked about, hey, maybe some of these things are going to be things you bring back to your team. You might not have something that you need to change, but it might be something helpful for someone else. So keep in mind the culture of your team, the communication styles that everyone has, as well as the collaboration between people. Absolutely, I will be delighted if there's new and exciting things for you in this talk, but there may not be, and that's okay. The product. This is not the SQL Projects product. This is your product. What do you ship out the door? How frequently can you ship it out the door? What level of value can you provide from the API changes that you need to make, from the UI changes you need to make, a new feature that's requested super high priority because someone needs it tomorrow? What are the roadblocks in the way for that product to be of value? This is where I get really excited, because we're talking about process, and then spoiler alert, the last one is tools. The process means that you can do the same thing again and again. It's not, oh, we need to make a database update. Can anyone find that wiki page that tells us what we need to do? So-and-so left 6 months ago and they knew what it was. Having a process that you can repeat and do it frequently enough that it doesn't get lost to a wiki page is super valuable. But usually having an automatable or repeatable process does mean that there are some tools involved. Us as humans are extremely valuable, but the tools help us be able to do things and pull it all together. So when we talk about SQL projects and SQL development today, we're going to bring all of those DevOps components in. I'm actually going to start by talking about EF Core development for just a very brief moment, not to alarm anyone, but I want to start there because a lot of times SQL projects and ORM-based development are seen as kind of antithesis to each other. We'll start from there. Then we'll dive into a little bit more about what's in a SQL project, what does that entail, some of the newer things that are a part of the Microsoft.Build.Sql projects, which is an SDK, newer from the SQL Server data tools in Visual Studio. In the middle, we're going to take a brief departure and talk about Microsoft Fabric. This is previously known as the analytics platform that Microsoft has, but SQL database has landed in Fabric. And there's some very cool things that you as developers are going to want to be aware of when you have this platform that can help with database development. And then before we get to the end, I'm going to talk about the scary part of how do we deploy database changes and the development process that we have up until that point, how can it help us out? So we've got all that to cover in about 75 minutes. But like I said, let's start from just doing some EF Core development. I'm not an EF Core developer. It's not my bread and butter, so it's going to be awkward, but we'll make it through. In general, when I think about a .NET project's lifecycle, I have some C#. When I build it, I get some kind of executable or a library, and then eventually I deploy it off to an app host. Like it's just like a copy paste. I've got people that are involved. I'm trying to create a product of value. There's this process that I can follow, and then tools that help me do it. I don't actually think about those four things. I'm just like, I'm going to build and ship this. Help me get it out the door. Well, the good news is that I was fully capable of, yes, following the EF Core tutorial to start working on the Contoso University site. I started with the students page. I want to be able to register different students at Contoso University. So I just started defining my data model. It is beautiful. It is absolutely gorgeous. I didn't have to write any SQL to do this. And when I run EF Core migrate, it puts this in the database. I mean, it's so simple, it's straightforward, and then I get to make that wonderful web page. Like, I'm on my way and I'm developing. Like, nothing can go wrong. Well, despite the fact that, yes, I was able to do this, as I open up the page, I can see that it's talking to my local development instance. Great. When I check my code into source control, I've set up some CI pipelines. Just on main, just kind of keeping an eye on things. It's a .NET project. It's a bunch of C# and stuff. So I could do .NET build, .NET test. Like that totally makes sense from the C# realm of things. But what about this data model? Those of you that have EF Core exposure are probably looking at and have those find the errors challenges. You're like, I see 7. This despite being nice and pretty and simple and obviously a fundamental part of EF Core, this is not great for my database. And on my SQL CI workflow, it's saying, hey, I've run some code analysis on your database side of this project, and it's giving me some feedback. There's a lot to unpack here. At this point, all I want to point out is that just because I checked my EF Core C# code into source control, I was able to automate to a point where I am getting code analysis feedback on the database component. This is not based on the C# code. This is based on what would happen in the database. I enabled a rule that I wrote custom, which I will show you a little bit later today, that watches out for max-sized columns. SQL does a pretty good job doing size compression and not always allocating huge amounts of space for max-sized columns that you're storing things like names in that are generally not max-sized values. But you still don't want a ton of these just hanging around in your database if you can help it. So because this is a mistake that I commonly make when I'm developing an EF core, I'm able to get this warning out. The point that I'm illustrating here is that I was able to go from general EF core development by adding CI workflows. This is GitHub. The same thing applies to Azure DevOps. And with the ability to go ahead and set up a sidecar container, just using a SQL Server image in my pipeline, going ahead and running those migrations so that I get a database that I can start to analyze. So when I think about if I want to use SQL projects down the road, whatever the development system is around it, even if it's not writing with SQL, it could be using EF core, it could be using Dapper, it could be using something that's not C#. Whatever the development system is, if you end up with a database and database changes, you can still build automation on top of it. Obviously, this being a developer conference, it makes sense to start from something like EF core. But the other reason why I bring this up is because sometimes it's a lot less about needing a development process around your database. You already have some kind of development process and it's working, but you have some databases where you're like, I just need this in source control. The people that are making changes, they're making changes, it works great, but we really don't know what's going on in that database. The same kind of process can be used to get your database just into source control. So how do we get there? When I do CI from the standpoint of I'm starting with a database that's already being created, I have two questions about my database. Is it valid? And is it good? That second one is a lot more subjective. Is it valid is just giving me a moment to use that sidecar container and make sure that the migrations will run. The model that's being generated by EF core is going to be something that works with SQL Server. You might be able to make sure that we haven't missed generating some of the migration scripts, things like that. But the is it good is where we take the state of that SQL container and reverse engineer that out so we can analyze the code. When I have a database, there's a CLI we'll talk a lot more about today called SqlPackage, and it's able to extract or reverse engineer that whole database out for me to SQL files. At the bare minimum, this is your source control right here. You can check that into source control. You can have an automated pipeline that does that. So you can see this is the change that EF core is going to make. This is the change that that random developer made to the database manually, didn't tell anyone, they added 5 indexes. Totally fine. But the thing about having SQL files is that they can become a SQL project. And then you start to get more stuff on top of that. One of which is code analysis. The next is environment portability. If you ever need another developer database, there's 12 ways to get there, and one of which is to ship out your SQL project and get a copy, empty database from scratch to start from. But this also helps you then get to the point of being able to do database level comparison. So this could be, I need to know what changes have been made so I can cherry pick some out. This is also getting you on the way. And when you build a SQL project, that's when you get that code analysis and other model-based things because you're getting a DAC pack. There's a lot that EF core has going for it because it gets you so far through your development process. The other place where SQL projects can help you out is with the migrations for your database. There are a lot of instances where those EF Core migrations are going to be the right deployment plan. I want to be very clear, I'm not throwing shade at EF Core at all. However, when you get into more complex database environments, maybe you have other objects also being added to the same database, or you have another team that also needs to be working on that database. This is kind of getting that culture thing we talked about with DevOps, where you could have multiple groups collaborating. Then your SQL projects deployments may be the place where they have better controls on it. So what is in a SQL project? I just kind of gave you a scenario where it might help you out to get better robust feedback as well as additional controls. But what all is going on? It's a .NET SDK. Surprise. It has a build process. I'm going to use air quotes very heavily there. Well, what it is it's that collection of SQL files, all the objects being defined, create T-SQL statements. They're not alter. You don't have to remember, well, I created the table 6 months ago and I put the 5 columns in it. Then somebody added another column and now I want to add 3 more. So this is the alter table. No, you just have one statement for that table, that create table statement. When the air quotes build process happens, all of those SQL scripts are combined in memory into a database model. I'm calling it a database model because it's a conceptual thing. It's the validation that the foreign key references exist. You will have a build failure, yay, if you have written invalid T-SQL, or you have a foreign key that references a column that doesn't exist. Those kinds of things get caught. And so this is kind of one of those benefits for people that like to artisanally handcraft their databases. This can help put guardrails on that too, to help you make sure that things are valid as you go. But when that kind of model gets created and it's written, when you have .NET development, you get an executable or a library, one of those things. The output from a SQL project build is a DACPack file. I cannot take credit for naming it. It is incredibly hard to say. It has another cousin that is also hard to say. But those DACPack files are that database model. It's just a bunch of XML in a zip folder with a different file extension. But it has been put together, and now it is portable and reusable. You could, bad security practices aside, put it on a flash drive, carry it around, and just be like, this is a database. Now, the nice thing is that these are like those DLLs, like those library files, things that you can archive easily. Now we're talking. Now we have tracking our database over time. Now, around your SQL project, I've talked all about the database objects, but there's extra fancy things. We saw a little bit of code analysis a few minutes ago, so there's extra checks that can happen on that database model. But on top of that, you can set database settings, database-wide settings. You want to turn change tracking on. Great. You want the entire database to be a ledger database because you need to serialize out all the changes. You need to change the collation. All of those things can be captured in a database setting. So if you are deploying fleets of databases, anybody ever has to manage like 100, 1,000 databases, this is where it starts to really scale up for you. Pre and post deployment scripts, in a nutshell, if you have additional changes that you need to do some static data management or extra data cleaning, you can build those right into your deployment artifact. Now, if this is something that you develop with or have in the background, how do you work with it? You need a toolkit of things that will enable you to use them, because there is no one right way to use SQL projects. There are way too many options for everybody to use it the same way. Let me just put it that way. First off, if you are looking to get your hands on SQL projects and use them as a part of development and not just in automation, You've got Visual Studio and you've got VS Code. Both of those have SQL projects in them. In Visual Studio right now, 2022, you've got SSDT, SQL Server Data Tools, and then there is a preview of the SDK-style SQL projects. It's a standalone component, and it has to be installed completely by itself. Kind of doesn't have any friends, but it is a way that if you are really looking to use the SDK for SQL projects in Visual Studio, that is one way to do it. The other option is to use VS Code, which has the SDK-style SQL projects and has gotten a number of different improvements. I will do live demos today, and we'll kind of poke around in VS Code, so you'll get to see more of that. But that would be where you kind of, if you are looking to manually develop your database with those SQL files, you'll be able to use those developer environments. If you're in GitHub or Azure DevOps for your pipelines, there are built-in tasks there. I'll be very honest, I don't love them. They're kind of limited in what they can do, but if you're just looking to, like, you really want to get deployments going, they'll help you manage firewall rules in Azure and things like that. Great. But I have a favorite child, and it's SqlPackage, because that command line gives you a bunch of different options for things that you can do. That'll be one of the things that I demo today. It is so exciting to demo a command line interface, let me tell you, because it's not like super flashy, but it just does a lot of really utilitarian things. So this means that you can go back and forth between files and databases, and you can get information on the deployment that could happen if you are okay with it. These last two categories are a little bit more complicated and interesting. Fabric is kind of the newer player to the SQL Projects ecosystem. We'll talk about that in just a little bit, but there's lifecycle management built into the Fabric platform for both SQL database in Fabric and the data warehouse in Fabric. So it has a source control integration that is, spoiler alert, SQL Projects in the background. This last category is why organizations that use SQL Projects fairly often find that they can make it do just about anything they want if it's the right fit. This is also the point where I'm going to tell you that if you have a database DevOps process and toolkit that works for you and it's not SQL Projects, I'm not mad at it. If you have DevOps that's working, awesome. Like, there are so many tools out there. There's great companies like Redgate and Liquibase that have sweet DevOps packages. If they're working, awesome. But if you're looking at SQL Projects and you're like, but I have this scenario where I'm not sure, there's so much built-in extensibility. I had that custom code analysis rule that we'll talk about. The deployments themselves, you can have extensions on to always manipulate them if you have custom rules that you need. So there's a lot. You can even write your own SqlPackage CLI by using the .NET library. Question?
And now we use SQL Server data tools, and we'll do like database import to create projects. Is that the same projects from like SDK? Are they different?
So the question, repeating it for the recording and for the rest of the room, was there's SQL Server data tools in Visual Studio, and when you import a database into there, that's a SQL project. We've mentioned today, and I've kind of danced around the SDK for SQL projects and kind of, are they the same and are they different? It's the same set of SQL files, but the project file itself is slightly different. The Visual Studio SQL Server data tools before 2015 through 2022, it's a .NET Framework style project file. So every single SQL file is listed if you open up that SQL file. And to build it, you have to have Visual Studio installed. So if you throw it into a pipeline, it has to be Windows and it has to have Visual Studio installed. The SDK SQL proj file, SQL Server data tools cannot load that project type.
Is there a migration?
The question was kind of, is there a migration between the two? And I'm pausing because there absolutely is a migration. You can take your original SQL project, delete out a bunch of a lot of the lines from the .SQL proj, and add the SDK target. the consequences of that migration is that you would then use VS Code or the preview component in Visual Studio. VS Code is going to honestly be the richer environment then. But then if you are heavily based on Linux CI pipelines, you would be able to build those SQL projects there. The API extensibility, that was part of the original SQL Server data tools, so that is not specific to the SDK-style SQL projects. The things that are specific to the SDK are being a cross-platform build, so just .NET build with .NET 8 or above installed, and then being able to do package references, which is something that I'll dig into more. There's database references, but there's not like package feed references in the original ones. That's something that's been added. We can definitely talk about it later for sure. So my favorite child, SqlPackage. If you've used SqlPackage before, you might have downloaded the bespoke.zip folder for the self-contained executable because it was like 2002. And that's how we distributed software back in the day. There is a .NET tool for it now, which makes it a lot easier to keep it up to date, as well as to make sure that you are getting all of the .NET patches. So this is definitely something I would recommend. The other thing that I want to do is give just a little bit of love to the engineering team behind SqlPackage, because I said, how can we get people the fixes and new features as early as possible for SqlPackage? We ship the preview versions out onto the NuGet feed for the .NET tool. So if you watch the release notes on SqlPackage and see things that are interesting, want to give them a try, you can definitely grab the preview version there. So this is something that you can install on any environment. So this is definitely a cross-platform tool. How did we get that SQL project out of our pipeline sidecar container earlier? How did we, we took EF core, we ran the migrations, we got all those objects, but they were in the database. Somehow we got a SQL project and all those files that we could run code analysis on and potentially check into source control. This is where SqlPackage has that extract capability that I can either take out to SQL files or I can take out to a DAC pack. The DAC pack, again, it's this self-contained thing. It's not particularly helpful to us human beings, so we go out to those SQL files. The publish operation is the most well-known DAC pack to database process. There's a bunch of other things that we can do between the DAC pack and the database that we'll talk about later, but just keep in mind that that's kind of the reverse of the extract. And then before we hop into looking at VS Code, the last concept that I wanted to introduce is the code analysis that we previewed in the pipeline earlier. The code analysis runs as a part of the project build. So the model is pulled together, all of the object relationships, the column sizes, the data types, everything is analyzed. In fact, it even looks at the target platform, or what are you developing for? Are you developing for SQL Server? Are you developing for Azure SQL Database? Is this SQL Server 2016 or 2025? Because it's going to check and make sure you're not doing something in that code that isn't supported for your particular version. You have SQL Server 2016 at home. Awesome. That's the target platform. Then you see a really cool sample that uses the JSON data type. Yes. You put it in your SQL project and the build fails. Because it says, hey, you're using 2016 for your SQL Server, can't quite use that yet. So you can either change your target platform in your SQL project and develop for a future version, or roll back, but it's going to kind of protect you around that. The other kind of model validation it does is it runs these code analysis rules. There's 14 rules by default. Some of them are relatively obvious, like select star. Some of them are a little bit more on the fringe, and there's really only 14, like that's not that many. I have found way more mistakes to make with SQL than 14. Sure, you know people that have too. So you can bring in custom rules, and there's a number of MVPs and other people in the community that have shared hundreds of rules. This was great, except for installing the rules for the original SQL Server Data Tools SSDT in Visual Studio meant copying those library files into the extensions folder within Visual Studio. A little painful. Now you can bring in custom rules with package references in your SQL project file. So as you have those scenarios where you're like, we are going to stop using max length columns as we hammer away at our development, you can incorporate those just by putting a package reference in your project. So not only can you run code analysis, you can set rules to cause a full-on build failure. You're just tired of seeing select star, that kind of thing. Or you can say, you know what, this rule just does not apply to us, and cancel it out. All right. So what would it look like to get a SQL project for this database? So I'm going to get myself a terminal, and I'm also going to stop this. Getting myself a terminal, I have a local container running with all of my EF tables on it. So getting a SQL project for this is not so bad. And I also pre-wrote the command ahead of time. My action is my first parameter. I want to extract. I'm going to give it a connection string. This is my development instance, so I'm using SA and a password. That is not your great security posture if you're using a shared developer environment, things like that. SqlPackage can do managed identity, it can do Windows auth, all of those things that are specific to more secure environments, it's going to be able to handle as a part of that connection string. So you can just grab any old .NET connection string. And then this is the target file. I just want to put all of my files into a folder called ContossoDB. And then I want to extract to schema and object type organization. Well, before I hit go, just to kind of prove what's going on here, I just want to add another folder for ContossoDB in here and get those SQL files. And that's all it took for me to reverse engineer my database. And you see how quickly this could be something that's automated to get those definitions out. It could even be part of the code that you check in. And these are just the create statements. And we can start comparing to our workflow for checking the code analysis. I installed SqlPackage. I installed the templates for SQL projects. And I also grabbed the SQL CMD CLI. Now I also created a new SQL proj. So let me create that new SQL proj. So this, for those of you that have seen SSDT-style SQL project files, this is like 3 miles too short because it's 9 lines. But by default, it includes all of the .SQL files in the folder, so I don't have to worry about all that care and feeding. So I can run my .NET build, and I should get my DAC pack output. It's just a zip file, it's compiled, there's nothing fun to look at in there, but I can use this further down the process. But when I ran .NET build, I didn't enable code analysis. So it just made sure that the references all worked. We're not really surprised because this was just a database. But if I say run SQL code analysis equals true, it'll at least run the code analysis. It's not going to find anything because I haven't added my custom rule. It just ran those 14 default rules. Nothing too exciting there. How do we add packages? .NET add package. Going back to our SQL project file, again, hopefully for those of you that are .NET developers, this is not feeling too terribly uncomfortable. And this time around, we get a bunch of warnings that we've used max length columns. Huh. Now, in VS Code, I have the database projects extension installed. I've just been doing everything from the command line. Nothing wrong with that. Like I can literally use File Explorer and edit these tables. I can add views, store procedures, and anything else I want in the database. But the database projects extension is also here for me because it gives me some more UI assistance. So instead of typing .NET Build into the terminal, I can click Build. Instead of hitting .NET Build, run SQL code analysis, there's an option for build code analysis. I can even kick off the publish process if I want to update my local development database from VS Code. Where it becomes more helpful, and if you're familiar with Visual Studio, you know you have the item templates, similar concept here to be able to add different objects. Shout out to the target platform. This is one of those properties that's in the project file, but it's something that'll give you an assistive list so you don't have to like memorize the different names or look at the documentation because that's always super far away. That's another option there. So that gives us a development environment to kind of continue to iterate on our database. I mentioned earlier the concept of, hey, at least your database is in source control now. That is kind of the linear, my database is in source control and I'm the only one updating it. But the thing about using SQL projects and then that development being in source control is now you can start to merge database changes together and potentially have consolidated deployments. Not that you want to wait months between database deployments, but maybe you say, hey, we have 5 changes to make this week. We could have 5 windows of maintenance, or we could have 1. Let's merge all the changes together and then generate 1 deployment for them. So that's just kind of food for thought as you think about how do I incorporate my database in source control. You can definitely get that benefit there. So I did the .NET new SQL proj from the templates earlier, but sorry, I forgot .NET new list. Ooh, it's been a rough day. There's also a SQL code analysis template. Now, again, I'm not an EF Core developer, and unfortunately, I have decayed in my time as a PM, and I would not even call myself a .NET developer anymore. But I was able to write that code analysis rule for detecting max character length. I was shocked, but AI helped. You thought you were getting away from AI, but not in this talk. So I was able to go from the, that is very small. I was able to go from the template for a code analysis rule to one that it was able to detect max character length. Yes, I totally asked Copilot to help me, but you can too. Start from the template. It's a very basic example that's looking for wait for delay statements, which is basically like the pause task of SQL. I don't know why we have it. But it was then able to kind of modify this to interrogate the model. And I'm pulling this up not because I expect you to come out of here ready to write your own code analysis rule today. That would be awesome. But what I want to highlight from this is it's using those SQL Projects APIs, so .NET libraries, to be able to interact with that conceptual model of a database. Say, we're going to start looking at tables. That's where this rule applies. And then within those tables, I'm going to have to visit each column. And for each column, I have a nice little utility function that checks to see if that column is the max character length. You could do this to enforce naming schemes for your organization. You could do this to look for columns that are named money but are in floats. I have seen that. There's kind of different clever things that you can do to watch for, especially as you're cleaning up an environment. It can help you pull those things out. So the point of this little sidebar was code analysis is very extensible. By all means, you can go pick up the hundreds of available rules. But if you have specific things for your environment, start from that .NET New template for SQL code analysis and then iterate from there. If I can do it, you can do it. All right, so SQL database and Fabric. Super exciting for us at Microsoft. Why is it exciting for you? Why am I taking your valuable time today to talk about SQL database and Fabric? Now, Fabric, the platform, if you've heard about it, you've probably heard about it in the analytics context. Data warehouses, pipelines, like data pipelines, notebooks, super cool stuff for large data sets. Azure SQL Database is a highly transactional database. It can scale from like half a CPU to 80 CPUs, depending on the tier you're on. I mean, it runs major applications. And that is what we wrapped within Fabric for SQL Database and Fabric. It is, SQL Database and Fabric is a real transactional database. You could put kind of pretty much any line of business application that you're looking for even more of a platform wrapped around it than Azure. For those of you that are like clinging to the bare metal for your dear life, this is going to be a very scary section for you. I apologize. But it does bring highly simplified provisioning. I have a demo that you will not believe if you've tried to create a database in Azure. It does mean that there is then that browser-based query editor. So if you're looking to do ORM deployments and then just barely have to touch the query editor, that might be a good option. Within the database, you have easier connectivity to the analytics parts of Fabric. But where it gets really interesting is the integrated lifecycle management. Now, the different components within Fabric, things like notebooks, they needed to have source control. They didn't have the benefits of coming from things like .NET development, where it's just part of the process. So when we brought database, SQL Database into Fabric, we said, well, for integrated source control, we know what we want to write back out. And those are our SQL projects. In Azure, you have the concept of a resource group. In Fabric, you have the concept of a workspace where you can add different objects. This would be where you add a SQL database. That workspace then can be connected to a branch of a repository. And now all of a sudden, the changes that you're making to these objects in Fabric can now be checked into source control or updated from source control. I have some recorded demos that I'm going to talk over here for just a few moments. So like I mentioned, with the provisioning of a SQL database in Fabric, there's a bajillion ways that you can get a development database stood up, including taking that SQL project and deploying it out. But if you have to stand up a container and things like that, this is kind of simplifying it. When you have a workspace, it doesn't have to be empty, but in this case it is. This is where you connect it to source control. I'm pausing for a second because I have to select all of the Azure DevOps options to get to my branch selection. It is a workspace to a branch because you can effectively branch your workspace as you go. Say you're developing your database, you get to a certain point and you're like, I want another one. There's the option in Fabric to branch your workspace. It gives you a new branch of your repository and it gives you a copy of that workspace. I'm putting a folder inside of my branch for this workspace content because I'm kind of a nut for utility scripts. I like having all those extra things around my code, so I make sure I have plenty of space for it. It's just a personal preference. But when I go over into Azure DevOps, I can see that it was able to create that Fabric workspace folder for me, and it's empty because my workspace is empty. But if I carry on, now when I start creating items in Fabric, like that SQL database, literally just give it a name. That's all. The default is to a serverless database that'll auto-pause in 15 minutes. It'll scale up and down as the workload requires. So there's a lot fewer controls, but for a lot of my main workloads, this is going to work out well. But now I have the source control built right on top of it. So boring empty database, checking that into source control, I'm going to get an empty SQL project. Not particularly exciting, but I wanted to give that really crisp picture of how easy it is to get source control set up if you are looking to have that as a part of a database. This isn't the right fit for every application. This is something that we were missing as a part of the SQL Server Azure SQL database family, is a simplified database that it's easier to have source control and a bunch of other stuff on top of. So depending on the application that you're developing, now you have something where committing it into source control, being able to make changes to it and collaborate with others in that shared environment can be a lot easier. And so within just a few minutes, I've got my objects in that database, and now they're also in source control. And if I put them side by side and hop into the Object Explorer, you can kind of see how they compare. If you're unfamiliar with SQL projects, you've got all of those objects over there on the right in source control. Now, the fun part about this is that you also get your Git history from the changes that you make, as well as even like stored procedure definitions, which isn't something we've seen today. It's just a part of SQL projects. Now, I hinted at this earlier when I talked about the SQL package publish, how it can apply the database, the SQL project to the database. And that same thing is true within Fabric. I can take this out to VS Code, so kind of building upon the things we've talked about that you can do with regular SQL projects. I take that repository that has my SQL project from Fabric. I can start editing and making changes with the database projects extension. So in this case, maybe I want to update a table or modify a view. But you've got the exact kind of same layout of all of the objects from that Object Explorer. But in this case, I've gone offline. There's the benefits of Fabric being a collaboration environment, but then also the drawback that if you're editing that database, other people may be in it. So in this case, I can add a folder for stored procedures and then add that stored procedure file for my sample procedure. I'm not great at naming things, so sample proc is what we went with. And I use select star, so shame on me. Nobody's surprised. I can do all of the kind of build and code analysis stuff that I did from VS Code earlier. So just because it's a SQL project from Fabric, it's all the same SQL projects, it's just a different target platform. I got errors because I forgot my create procedure statement. So again, SQL projects definitely help us out when they catch these kinds of errors. I didn't check this code into source control and find out about it 15 minutes later when the CI pipeline crashed. I was able to catch it earlier in the process, which is nice. And then when I get a successful build, I'm able to then go ahead and check things into source control and carry on. I won't make you watch me commit things. But when it shows up in source control, this is the other part that can be a little bit scary. If you're used to just running migrations and things happening magically, great, this will be fine. But if you like more control, avert your eyes. In Fabric, I can do update from source control. That stored procedure isn't there yet, but when this panel finally loads, it's comparing the database state to the source control, and it says what's in source control is new, it's exciting, there's something new. Go ahead and hit update all. We don't know what it is, but for the right application, this will give you a quick way to get those changes into the database. And when the deployment finishes about a minute and a half later, I can pop over back into the Object Explorer and my stored procedure will be there. So this is kind of that bi-directional source control integration within Fabric. One of the big reasons we built the source control integration on top of SQL Project was that we knew for SQL Database and Fabric, we wanted to have kind of iterative development as well as the ability to do validation and deployment. If these are things that we already have through SQL Projects in VS Code and Visual Studio, as well as through SqlPackage and Azure DevOps and our GitHub Actions, we didn't want people to have to learn a whole new toolkit just to go over to Fabric someday. So yeah, we already have SQL projects here, And then there are also SQL projects up in Fabric. So if you hear about in your organization, we're going to try Fabric for this, don't panic. You get to just take your toolkit with you. Speaking of not panicking, deploying. We just saw updating from source control in Fabric, and it was just like this thing that happened, which can be mildly disconcerting to really uncomfortable depending on how much control you like having over your database. When you have changes to make to your database, it can range from, I just need to change a stored procedure and we've tested the changes and we know everything's ready, this is fine, there's not going to be any performance impact, great, to we need to move some data around, we need to clean up some data before we do a deployment. There's a whole range of kind of different classes of deployments. It's not one size fits all. But where SQL projects help us is the tooling will let us manage whatever the state of the environment is. We don't have to know it ahead of time. Or even if you know the state of the environment, how sure are you? There are lots of organizations that have good controls over the databases, and they know that nothing has been changed by some third-party vendor's software or another team that has made changes. But in some instances, you want to be really, really sure. When we talk about publishing in this context, I'm talking about publishing and a few other operations that we can use to have successful deployments. But what happens when SqlPackage or Fabric is looking to take some code and apply it to a database is it loads two models into the program. It loads the one from the source, so from the DAC pack, from that SQL project. It says, this is the model that I want my database to look like eventually, and then it reverse engineers the database that it's looking to deploy to. So then it's able to compare the two. Oh, this table has a new column. I don't need to run create table. What do I need to do? Based on those model differences, it's able to come up with a deployment plan. Why does it need a plan? Why isn't it just like, it has a list of differences and it runs them? Because sometimes changes have an order to them. You cannot create a foreign key before the table that the key is going to is created. Those kinds of things are also handled by this. From there, you get the script is generated. I put this one in the bottom corner, but I always hedge on it a little bit. That's script execution. That is the default behavior. When you run publish with SqlPackage, the script executes. Yes, it does the deployment. But that isn't what you have to do. Like, it's the one we talk about all the time. I'm changing that, obviously, because I keep saying don't do it. But you have other options. You have other options. Because, yeah, directly publishing, altering stored procedures, creating views, like the calculated deployment plan, if you're confident that it is low impact, or this is just a developer environment that you're fine blowing away, if you like, that's, go for it. Publish. Bam. Now, the other options, they're varying use cases. The deploy report is an XML output. It's not like a PDF that you could just hand off to someone, although I'm sure you could generate one. But it is a report for machines to read, generally, on what are the changes that are going to happen. The last option is the deployment script. For people that are well-versed in reading T-SQL, this is really helpful to them, because they'll scan through it and they'll be like, yeah, this, oh, well, maybe I could do this differently, or based on what I know about our environment, I want to do this differently. A lot of times it's just a check mark that, nope, SqlPackage is not trying to do anything crazy. But you have multiple options. These are different actions within SqlPackage. So there is publish, there is script, and there is deploy report. We will demo them in just a second. The other thing is that there are schema compare graphical interfaces in Visual Studio and in VS Code. So if you're ever curious, you're just like, well, I'm going to start doing publishing things, but I just kind of want to see, like, how many changes do I have? You can do this. Now, this example graphic shows a DAC-pack source to a target database. It could be in any arrangement. It could be two databases. You could just compare your developer environment to your elevated developer environment, production, whatever you want to call it. You could skip the middleman of SQL Projects and just use schema compare if that is what fits your scenario. This will show what objects have been added, modified, or deleted. So it'll give you that full kind of almost like a Git diff, but for databases, which again, standalone in of itself is pretty awesome. I mentioned earlier, like you want to be really sure about the state of the database, and that's why the tooling helps us make sure we're getting the most accurate plan. The schema compare is a good way for you to see visually those differences. As we start talking about deployments, I want to bring in, I'll say, one last feature of SQL Projects, and that is database references, effectively. When you're creating a SQL project, the example we had so far was a whopping 3 tables. Real-life SQL projects, 10,000 tables, that kind of thing. It happens. It does. There's a couple of things that happen. Like with any project, as it grows bigger, the build time takes longer. Yeah, and it's super unfortunate because then you're waiting around. With SQL projects, just like with libraries and applications, you can pull it apart into different pieces that have their own development lifecycle. You have a schema that never changes. It can be its own SQL project, and then you reference out to that. So you don't have to rebuild that SQL project every time. You're just referencing the DAC pack. Now your build time is reducing out because it's not having to build all 10,000 objects, only 5,000, for example. Now, one of the changes that's a part of the SDK for SQL projects is that these database references can be on package feeds. We used that for the code analysis rules earlier, but this can also apply to database objects. The example I gave was for a single schema within your database, but if you're developing for SQL Server and you have cross-database references, as long as they are not circular references, as long as they are not circular references, you can have different projects for different databases and refer between them and use 3-part naming within your SQL projects. You still have that kind of development lifecycle. You can publish those to package feeds, and then again, you're not having to share a bunch of files between teams, but have different release cycles. So yes, the DAC pack or SQL Proj reference is a part of all of the SQL projects, and then the package reference itself is new to the SDK-style SQL projects. All right. So I'm going to show just a few of the deploy options and how they can be leveraged before we wrap things up. I have another slightly more complex SQL project. It is a whopping 10-ish tables, couple stored procedures, couple views, not much. And I have it deployed here in my local development environment. I'm going to go ahead and open up schema compare, and I'm going to compare from the database into my project. Now, I'm doing this just so that I can kind of show you what the state of the database is right now before we start running deployments. But as a developer, I could be doing this just to update my SQL project from the database. Say some changes have been made and I want to add them to my SQL project. I can hit apply and actually create those new files in my SQL project. Right now, it looks like the database is missing my select star view, which by now none of you are surprised. There's a new stored procedure. There's a change to the events table. Apparently I'm adding the column parent event ID. And the venue column is being expanded to 120, is smaller in the database at 50 characters instead of 128. So I've got a couple changes going on here. This could make for a very interesting deployment. But nobody ever wants to hear interesting deployment. So what would that deployment look like from a scripting perspective? Before I do anything, let me go ahead and run a build. Because my source file here is that DAC pack. I have one, but I'm not positive it's the latest and greatest. So let me run build real quick. And earlier, before I was playing around with my project, and I've got a cool code analysis rule that I just wanted to show off real quick. Because of the way code analysis rules can interrogate the model, it actually is catching in my stored procedure. When I create a new venue, I'm taking in 128 characters, and venue name is getting written to a table, venues, where the column is only 50 characters. 128 into 50, what happens? That's how you end up with like really vague things in your database. But for the sake of time, let's go ahead and make sure I'm in the right. Let's go ahead and get our actual deployment script. So local database, again, lovely SQL auth, but we could be using managed identity. And now I'm getting my actual deployment script out. What is this? This is not T-SQL. There's a really cool thing in SQL Projects where you can add variables. And they stay variables until you deploy. So you could have default values that are different for each of your 500 databases. And at deploy time, you set it. You don't have to rebuild. But the rest of it is T-SQL. So these are technically called SQL CMD variables. They are very cool, but I will not bore you more about them. I've got to drop my foreign key. Why are we dropping a foreign key, I wonder? Oh, dropping. I am rebuilding a table. It's a good thing I'm good at reading T-SQL. I'm not. This is kind of a little bit of a warning sign. Rebuilding a table is a bunch of lines of code. You might notice this deployment script's really long in the mini-map. It's creating a temporary table. It is a permanent table with a temporary name. And it is copying all of the data because I put a column in the middle of the table. Yikes. Because I added that parent event ID to my event table, to put a column in the middle of the table, you actually have to create a new table. Now, I might not even know that because the deployment will take care of it. It's moving all the data to this temporary table, and then it's renaming it to events after it removes the original one. I'm not going to have data loss, but what if this table is really sensitive, has a lot of transactions going on it, or it's really busy, or it's really big? I would want to know about this. Have an auto log on it. Yeah, so there's all kinds of scenarios where you could have a lot of activity on a table that you want to be aware of. This is where those intricacies about your environment and which things are most important to watch for can be automated. I'm going to create a deploy report real quick so you can get a quick view at it is a bunch of XML. I removed my XML formatter. I am sorry. It is a bunch of really ugly XML. But it lists out the operations, and it also has a section for alerts. This is not particularly human readable, but by the time you open the second one, you're probably going to be thinking to yourself, I wonder if there's a way for me to parse it with some kind of programmatic language, I don't know, like C# or PowerShell or Bash or Python if you're feeling spicy. I have a deploy report parser. It's a little bit of PowerShell that I managed to write. And it spits back out to me Markdown. Why do I write PowerShell that spits out Markdown? Because that is how I do things like that GitHub summary of code analysis rule output. That's just Markdown. A lot of the deployment and CI/CD environments, they're just looking for Markdown to spit out. So in this case, we parse the XML to a little bit of Markdown. And it's saying, hey, on your sensitive objects, DBO events, I have a data motion alert. The table is going to be rebuilt. All I've done in that PowerShell is give it a list of sensitive objects, and it'll tell me when something's happening to one of those objects. Everything else is fine. It'll just kind of summarize it for me, but it can highlight with flashing lights or marching ants or whatever HTML tag you want to use the things that you will need to be concerned about. So if I step back, this is why I say you have options for how you do your deployments, is you have those kind of different levers. And if you think of this in terms of a deployment, how can you deliver value when you're not even deploying yet? Putting gates in front of it, yes. Because now you're going to start understanding, is my SQL code good and valid? That's step 2, where you've got that CI pipeline that's validating the changes. Could be reverse engineering something from an ORM. It could just be a SQL project. The team has approved it. Step 3 said, hey, this can go into main. And immediately main takes a look at what's in there and calculates that deployment plan. It could spit out the deployment script. It could split out the deployment report. Or it could do all of the above. And then nothing happens. But we didn't deploy. So how is this valuable? Because we're now able to act on, can we do deployments? Are we ready? Can we plan this deployment? Do we need to fix anything? So now you've got people that can click approve and reject. I think I have a screenshot of that on the next slide. Because now you can do that review, your stoplight, yellow, red, green. And when your deployment is approved by hitting merge pull request, the artifacts, that is not the right slide. There we go, gate pipelines. You've got Azure DevOps on the right, GitHub Actions on the left. Both of these platforms have the ability to do environment approvals. Automated deployments doesn't mean they have to be automatic. They just could be a repeatable process that you have. So when we think about how do we fit SQL projects into having database DevOps that work, we get some kind of CI pipeline that not only checks our application code, but also checks the database contents that's going in, so that when we're merging our changes together, we know we're not royally screwing up, or we know how we're royally screwing up at least. Do we accept that? We can archive artifacts. I didn't even touch on this. With deployments and deploy scripts and all of those things being reversible, if my source is usually my DAC pack and my target is my database, what if I need to roll back? You can do a compare in the other direction. You can do it ahead of time. Because there's a couple different scenarios where you need to roll back. One is your database is a problem. The other is there's another problem somewhere else in the app stack. It is always the database's fault, right? It's never anybody else. Nope. Sometimes there's something wrong somewhere else in the stack and you still need to roll the database back. You can calculate that ahead of time because you just reverse your source and target. That can be one of the artifacts that you archive is I have a deploy script and I have an oh no script. So you can have that T-SQL because you may be collaborating with people that are not .NET developers, that are database admins, that are database developers. They don't really care that you used Razor Pages. They just want to know why you're rebuilding a table. That T-SQL is great for them. So you can have a database lifecycle that is very similar to your .NET development lifecycle. You have a SQL project that could be automatically generated or something that gets created that is built into some kind of artifact, a DAC pack, and that gets deployed to a database. If you put nothing else in your toolbox, the SqlPackage CLI and then the templates will get you a good amount of ways into just exploring. spend 10 minutes checking it out. Now, if you are ready to really, really, really dive in, I have a couple requests for you. On the right, that QR code, which is also the link on the very bottom. As I mentioned, I'm the product manager working on SQL tools. One of the things is SQL projects in a lot of different places. And I want to know a little bit more about how people are using SQL projects in Visual Studio, as well as when they're crossing over into SSMS, and how different people see their database development. There's a couple questions in there. Nothing is required, so you can answer 2 things and click submit and be done if you feel like it. As a thank you for that, I have plenty of other resources. The documentation at the top gives you all the SQL projects documentation, and then the middle link is to a 4-part workshop. It is solely focused on GitHub right now, what we're working on getting them into Azure DevOps. It's a bunch of different labs that walks through different example pipelines. There's some cool stuff in there. It's technically an 8-hour workshop. Go ahead, your question? This way. Yeah. So yes, these are the 2 CLI components. And then these are your primary resources to start from. The top one is the Microsoft Docs on SQL projects. There's a bunch of different things in there, but that also will branch out into your Visual Studio docs, your VS Code docs. That'll help out a lot. The workshop in the middle, bunch of different example pipelines, ideas of how to do version control and all kinds of fun stuff. Survey on the bottom, very helpful to me. That is all I have today. Please fill out the survey. Thank you so much for your time. We're just about at time, so I'm actually going to take the mic off and I'll take your questions over to the side so the next speaker can come up and get ready. So thank you again.